It would be more of a feeling, I think, because when we were recording an album, we would feel that it's not fun anymore. We haven't got anything more to give, and that would be the time to split, you know.
You should have done that a long time ago then.
I know.
For decades, the world believed one story: 4 smiling faces, perfect harmonies, songs that felt timeless, a band that looked untouchable. But what if that story was only half the truth? At 79 years old, Benny Andersson has finally broken his silence, and what he reveals about his longtime partner Björn Ulvaeus is shaking the foundation of one of music's greatest legacies. This isn't about catchy melodies or chart-topping hits. This is about control behind closed doors, power struggles hidden in plain sight, and a partnership that was slowly tearing itself apart while the world kept dancing. For years, Benny said nothing. Not because there was nothing to say, but because saying it would have destroyed the myth. Until now. And what's coming out isn't nostalgic. It isn't gentle. And it definitely isn't the story fans were prepared to hear. Stay with us, because once you hear what really happened behind the music, ABBA will never sound the same again. The silence behind the songs. Picture this: a world that believed it knew everything about ABBA, a band frozen in time as the ultimate symbol of pop perfection, where every harmony felt effortless, every smile genuine, and every success seemingly untouched by conflict. A musical fairy tale that appeared too polished to question. For decades, fans were fed an image of unity, of 4 artists moving in perfect synchrony, creating music that transcended borders and generations. Yet beneath that glittering surface, there was a silence that grew heavier with each passing year. For a long time, one man carried that silence alone. Benny Andersson, the musical architect behind ABBA's sound, chose restraint over confrontation, art over argument, believing that the music mattered more than the personal cost. But at 79, after a lifetime of holding his tongue, that silence finally cracked. And when it did, what poured out was not nostalgia or gentle reflection, but something far darker. His words did not simply revisit the past, they redefined it, exposing fractures that had existed almost from the beginning, and challenging everything the world thought it knew about his partnership with Björn Ulvaeus. This was never just about music. It was about control, about power, about what happens when collaboration slowly transforms into domination, and about how even the greatest creative partnerships can rot from the inside while the audience continues to applaud, unaware that the harmony they hear is masking a storm raging just beyond the microphone. The illusion of harmony. To the public, Benny and Björn were inseparable, 2 minds working as one, their names forever linked in songwriting credits, interviews, and history books, celebrated as one of the most successful creative duos of all time. They spoke the language of unity fluently, repeating phrases about mutual understanding and shared vision until those words became accepted as truth, and fans eagerly believed them because the music itself seemed to prove it. But those closest to the band knew that harmony was more illusion than reality. Behind the studio walls, the dynamic was far more complicated, shaped by 2 fundamentally different personalities pulling in opposite directions. Benny was introspective, emotionally driven, a musician who trusted instinct and feeling, someone who believed that a song should breathe, evolve, and reveal itself naturally. Björn, on the other hand, approached music with the precision of a strategist, always analyzing market potential, long-term legacy, and how each decision fit into a broader commercial framework. At first, this contrast created balance, but over time, balance gave way to imbalance. Creative discussions slowly shifted into directives, suggestions became final decisions, and what had once been a partnership of equals quietly transformed into a hierarchy. Benny began to sense it early on, though he struggled to articulate it, because from the outside everything still looked perfect, and success has a way of silencing doubt. Yet, internally, the relationship was changing, and the illusion of harmony was beginning to crack. Our names were together, but our voices were not. Publicly, every ABBA song carried both their names, a symbolic declaration of unity that suggested equal contribution and shared authorship. But privately, the reality was far more uncomfortable. Benny would bring melodies into the studio, rich with emotion and possibility, fragments of feeling waiting to be shaped into something timeless, only to watch as Björn reshaped them according to his own vision, often without consultation, and sometimes without acknowledgement. Lyrics were revised after sessions ended, song structures altered to fit a strategic narrative rather than an emotional one, and creative instincts that came from years of musical intuition were quietly overridden in favor of what Björn believed would perform better commercially. When Benny questioned these decisions, he wasn't met with open hostility or dramatic confrontation. Instead, he faced something colder and far more damaging: dismissal. His concerns were brushed aside with efficiency, framed as impractical or overly sentimental, as though emotional depth was a flaw that needed correcting. These moments didn't erupt into one defining argument. They accumulated slowly, hundreds of small slights, and overlooked contributions that settled into resentment. By the later years of ABBA's original run, insiders say Benny often felt like a visitor in a space he had helped create, present in name and credit, but increasingly sidelined in influence. The music remained magical, but the cost of maintaining that magic was growing heavier with every song. The consequences of Björn's approach didn't stop with Benny. They rippled through the entire band, particularly during recording sessions that became infamous for their intensity. Björn's pursuit of perfection was relentless, a standard so unforgiving that no performance ever felt complete, no take ever felt sufficient, and no mistake, however small, was tolerated. Agnetha, whose voice became one of ABBA's defining elements, was often pushed to the brink, repeating vocal lines long after exhaustion had set in, her physical limits tested in the name of sonic precision. Frida, equally disciplined and professional, felt the same pressure, the unspoken expectation to deliver flawless performances regardless of emotional or physical cost. What the audience heard as effortless brilliance was, in reality, the result of sessions that stretched late into the night, filled with mounting tension, strained patience, and quiet breakdowns that never made it onto the record. The studio, once a place of experimentation and joy, gradually turned into a battleground where control overshadowed creativity and perfection became a form of punishment. While Björn justified his methods as dedication to excellence, others began to see something darker, a need for dominance disguised as professionalism. The music may have soared, but behind the scenes, the human toll was undeniable. When the music followed them home. By the time the tension inside the studio became impossible to ignore, it had already begun spilling into places no microphone could capture. The conflicts that defined ABBA's creative process did not stay confined to chord progressions and lyric sheets. They followed the band members home, seeping into marriages, reshaping friendships, and slowly dismantling the personal lives behind the public image. What fans saw as a glamorous pop phenomenon was, in reality, a pressure cooker where professional dominance and emotional distance blurred into something far more destructive. As the music grew bigger, louder, and more lucrative, the emotional cost grew heavier, and nowhere was that cost more visible than in the relationships that once held the group together. Love, control, and the collapse of marriages. At first, the romantic partnerships within ABBA seemed like a perfect extension of the band's harmony. Two couples united by music, success, and shared ambition. Yet beneath that surface, the same patterns of control and imbalance that plagued the studio had quietly embedded themselves into their personal lives. Björn's marriage to Agnetha became the most visible casualty, though the public would not realize it until years later. Behind closed doors, Agnetha struggled under the weight of a relationship that mirrored the studio dynamic all too closely, where decisions were calculated, emotions often sidelined, and vulnerability mistaken for weakness. While Björn approached marriage with the same analytical mindset he brought to business and songwriting, Agnetha longed for emotional safety, privacy, and distance from the relentless machine that ABBA had become. Those needs clashed violently. Their separation was presented to the world as calm and mutual, a dignified parting between two adults who simply grew apart. But insiders paint a far darker picture, one filled with resentment, unresolved anger, and painful disputes that refused to fade quietly. The battle over their children became a defining fault line, with Agnetha desperate to shield them from the suffocating glare of fame, while Björn remained convinced that the ABBA legacy should extend naturally into the next generation, whether they wanted it or not. What followed were years of tension, legal negotiations, and emotional distance, leaving scars that lingered long after the paperwork was signed. Agnetha withdrew from the spotlight almost entirely, retreating into isolation, while Björn doubled down on work, using music, projects, and ambition as both armor and escape. As ABBA's global success cemented itself, Björn's identity shifted further away from artist and deeper into strategist, a transformation that unsettled those around him. Music was no longer just expression, it was an empire, and every empire needed to be protected, expanded, and monetized. While Benny remained emotionally attached to the art itself, Björn focused relentlessly on structure, ownership, and control. Reunion proposals, licensing deals, museum exhibitions, and later, ambitious virtual performances were not merely creative decisions. They were strategic moves designed to preserve dominance over the ABBA brand. To Björn, the past was not something to be remembered. It was something to be managed, optimized, and leveraged. To Benny, however, this approach felt like a betrayal of everything they had once created together. As Björn tightened his grip on financial and strategic decisions, Benny increasingly felt like a bystander in a legacy he had helped build from the ground up. Conversations that once flowed easily became transactional, stripped of warmth and mutual respect. The brotherhood that had defined their partnership deteriorated into a cold alliance, sustained only by contracts and obligations. Former collaborators noticed it too. Björn's aggressive negotiation style, particularly around royalties and credits, alienated industry figures who had once admired his precision. Relationships fractured quietly, doors closed without public explanation, and whispers circulated about a man who valued control above collaboration, profit above people. Lawsuits, loyalty, and a tarnished legacy. With control came conflict, and with conflict came the courtroom. Over the years, Björn found himself entangled in legal disputes that stood in stark contrast to the joyful melodies that defined ABBA's public image. Accusations surfaced, alleging manipulated contracts, withheld profits, and retroactive revisions that conveniently favored him. While some defended his actions as smart business, others saw them as ruthless, even predatory. These battles took a toll not just financially, but emotionally and reputationally. Former allies distanced themselves, unwilling to risk entanglement with someone whose pursuit of dominance had grown so uncompromising. Industry respect slowly shifted into caution, admiration tempered by wariness. Björn might have emerged legally intact, but the damage to trust was irreversible. For Benny, watching these disputes unfold was both painful and disillusioning. The songs they had once written with joy now echoed through courtrooms and legal documents, their meaning distorted by financial arguments and ownership battles. What had begun as a shared dream had become a source of bitterness, its legacy overshadowed by disputes that never should have existed. The irony was cruel. Music that had united millions around the world now stood as the backdrop to division, resentment, and fractured loyalty. Genius, memory, and the loneliness of control. By the time the legal battles quieted and the public drama faded into background noise, something far more unsettling had begun to take shape behind the scenes. The victories were still there, the accolades untouched, the legacy seemingly secure, yet beneath it all, the man who had fought so fiercely to control every detail of that legacy was beginning to lose his grip on something far more essential, himself. For Björn, the past had always been a resource, something to be curated, revisited, and refined. But time has a cruel way of reclaiming what even the most meticulous mind believes it owns. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly. Moments of forgetfulness brushed off as exhaustion or the natural cost of decades spent working at an unforgiving pace. A missed lyric here, a forgotten anecdote there. At first it seemed harmless, even ironic, given how vast his body of work was. But those closest to him noticed the pattern before he did. The way conversations looped, memories blurred, and once sharp recollections dissolved into uncertainty. For a man whose life revolved around words, structure, and narrative, memory loss was more than a medical concern. It was an existential threat. The irony was devastating. The same mind that had shaped ABBA's storytelling now struggled to recall key chapters of its own history. Frustration set in, followed by fear, then denial. Rather than slow down, Björn worked harder, burying himself in projects as if productivity could outrun divine. His personal relationships suffered deeply during this period. Remarried and outwardly settled, he was often emotionally absent, retreating into work whenever vulnerability surfaced. His children felt the distance too, growing up with a father physically present, yet mentally elsewhere, consumed by legacy management rather than connection. Resentment quietly took root, creating emotional gaps that no amount of success could bridge. As memory faded, control tightened. The more uncertain his internal world became, the more rigid his external one grew, creating a vicious cycle that pushed people away while convincing him he was protecting what mattered most. Over time, Björn's circle grew smaller. Former collaborators stopped calling. Old friends declined invitations. Conversations became formal, guarded, transactional. The warmth that once surrounded him evaporated, replaced by cautious professionalism and emotional distance. Those who remained often did so out of obligation rather than affection, unwilling to challenge a man whose need for control had become immovable. Business meetings felt colder, social gatherings rarer, laughter thinner. The man who once thrived on collaboration found himself increasingly alone, surrounded by contracts, archives, and projects that echoed louder than any genuine human connection. Even celebration felt hollow, stripped of shared joy. Meanwhile, Benny watched from a distance, conflicted and weary. He recognized the transformation not as sudden, but as the inevitable result of years spent prioritizing dominance over dialogue, strategy over empathy. What saddened him most wasn't the disputes or disagreements, but the realization that the man he had once admired was now trapped by the very ambition that had fueled his success. For decades, Benny had chosen restraint, believing silence was the price of peace and that time would soften old wounds. But time didn't heal the fractures. It widened them. Each reunion project, each new commercial venture, each strategic decision made without his voice reinforced a painful truth. The partnership they once celebrated no longer existed in spirit, only in branding. Recording sessions that had once sparked excitement became emotionally draining, filled with tension and unspoken resentment. Disagreements escalated more quickly, patience evaporated faster, and exits became louder. Doors slammed. Sessions ended abruptly. Conversations that once lasted hours were reduced to clipped exchanges and awkward silence. What had once been brotherhood had devolved into a cold coexistence. Benny no longer saw a collaborator across the room, but a gatekeeper, someone guarding a legacy with iron fists rather than open hands. The emotional distance became impossible to ignore, and eventually, impossible to tolerate. Breaking his silence wasn't an act of revenge. It was an act of release, a final attempt to reclaim his own narrative after years of being overshadowed within it. The myth of forever. For years, the word ABBA didn't just represent a band, it symbolized permanence, unity, and an almost mythological sense of togetherness that fans clung to long after the music stopped playing on the charts. The group was framed as something eternal, untouched by the decay that so often consumes creative partnerships, a rare exception in an industry built on ego and competition. But myths are fragile things, and the closer Benny looked back, the clearer it became that forever had always been an illusion carefully maintained, rather than a truth genuinely lived. Behind the carefully curated interviews and smiling reunion photos, there was exhaustion, emotional distance, and a shared understanding that the unity the public adored no longer existed in any meaningful way. What remained was obligation, legacy, and the quiet fear that admitting the truth would destroy something millions still believed in. As the years passed, Benny found himself carrying a burden heavier than any melody he had ever composed. The burden of maintaining a narrative that no longer aligned with reality. Every interview required restraint. Every public appearance demanded diplomacy. And every question about unity forced him to suppress decades of unresolved tension. Silence became his shield, but it was also his prison. The pressure intensified with each new revival of the ABBA brand. From anniversary releases to museum exhibits and carefully staged reunions. Each project reopened old wounds, reminding Benny that while the world celebrated togetherness, the emotional truth had been buried beneath contracts and compromises. He watched as decisions were made, announcements rolled out, and plans executed with minimal input from him, reinforcing the painful sense that his role had been quietly diminished. The music that once felt liberating now carried a strange heaviness, as if every familiar chord echoed with memories of conversations never finished and conflicts never resolved. Fans heard nostalgia. Benny heard ghosts. When the idea of reunion surfaced, the public imagined healing, reconciliation, and a return to harmony. But behind the scenes, there was no such closure. The meetings were polite but distant, structured rather than warm, with unresolved resentment hanging thick in the air. Old disagreements were never addressed, only avoided, creating an unspoken agreement to focus on logistics instead of truth. For Benny, these reunions felt less like celebrations and more like performances, carefully choreographed moments designed to reinforce a myth rather than reflect reality. The laughter felt rehearsed, the camaraderie restrained, and the excitement muted by an awareness that the bond that once fueled their creativity had long since eroded. The music could be recreated, the image restored, but the emotional connection was gone. Björn, ever focused on the broader picture, pushed forward with confidence, framing each reunion as a triumph of legacy and endurance. Benny, however, felt increasingly disconnected, wondering whether preserving the myth was worth the personal cost. Each appearance chipped away at his resolve, forcing him to confront the question he had avoided for years. How long could he continue pretending that the past hadn't hurt him? Eventually, silence stopped feeling noble and started feeling dishonest. Benny began to understand that protecting the ABBA story meant sacrificing his own voice, and that the cost of that sacrifice had become too high. His reflections weren't fueled by bitterness or revenge, but by a deep need for honesty, for acknowledgement, and for closure that had been denied for decades. Breaking his silence wasn't about tearing anyone down. It was about reclaiming agency over a story that had been simplified and sanitized beyond recognition. He wanted the world to understand that greatness can coexist with pain, that beautiful music can be born from deeply flawed relationships, and that harmony on record does not guarantee harmony in real life. As his words finally surfaced, fans were forced to confront a more complex version of ABBA, one that felt less magical, but far more human. The fairy tale didn't disappear, but it cracked, revealing the emotional labor and personal sacrifice hidden beneath its glittering surface. When the world finally listened, when Benny's words finally reached the public, they didn't explode all at once. Instead, they spread slowly, like a crack forming beneath a polished surface that had been walked on for decades without question. Fans who had grown up believing in ABBA as a symbol of unity suddenly found themselves re-examining every lyric, every interview, every smiling photograph with new eyes. What once felt timeless and uncomplicated now carried a shadow, and the story people thought they knew began to feel uncomfortably incomplete. This wasn't the kind of scandal built on shock headlines or dramatic accusations. It was quieter, heavier, and far more unsettling because it challenged something deeply emotional rather than merely factual. The idea that one of the most beloved musical partnerships in history had been held together by silence and compromise forced listeners to confront an uncomfortable truth. Perfection had always been curated. For many fans, Benny's revelations felt like betrayal, not of Björn, but of the dream ABBA represented. People who had used the band's music as the soundtrack to weddings, childhoods, and personal milestones struggled to reconcile that joy with the pain now revealed behind the scenes. Online discussions filled with disbelief, denial, and heated debate, as some rushed to defend Björn's legacy, while others expressed long-suppressed suspicions about the group's internal dynamics. Songs once associated with love and togetherness were suddenly reinterpreted through a darker lens. Lyrics sounding less romantic and more conflicted, melodies carrying an emotional weight that listeners had never noticed before. Fans began asking questions they had never considered, wondering whether the sadness woven into ABBA's later music had been a quiet confession all along rather than mere artistic evolution. Yet for others, the truth brought relief rather than disappointment. It humanized the band, transforming them from distant icons into flawed individuals navigating immense pressure, ambition, and emotional strain. The music didn't lose its power. It gained context. What had once felt unrealistically perfect now felt painfully honest. As attention shifted toward Björn, the conversation surrounding him grew far more layered and emotionally charged, refusing to settle into a simple narrative of hero or villain. To some, he remained a misunderstood perfectionist, a man whose relentless discipline and uncompromising standards were not acts of cruelty, but necessities, the driving force behind ABBA's unprecedented global success. Supporters argued that, without his strategic mindset, ironclad control, and long-term vision, the band might never have evolved beyond a fleeting pop phenomenon, and that the very qualities now being criticized were once the foundation of their greatness. But others saw something far more troubling in Benny's words, interpreting them as long overdue confirmation of behavior that had been whispered about for years. To this group, Björn's leadership wasn't merely firm, it was domineering, prioritizing authority over collaboration and legacy over loyalty. They viewed his approach as one that extracted brilliance at a cost, leaving emotional strain, fractured relationships, and quiet resentment in its wake. What some called discipline, others called control. And what some praised as ambition, others condemned as an inability to share power. Björn himself did little to resolve the growing divide. He remained largely restrained, offering carefully measured responses that neither fully denied the claims nor directly addressed their emotional impact. His words were precise, calculated, and notably devoid of vulnerability, focusing on facts rather than feelings, achievements rather than relationships. In the past, this restraint had been interpreted as dignity and professionalism, but in the wake of Benny's revelations, it took on a far more ambiguous tone. To some observers, his silence suggested quiet guilt, an unspoken acknowledgement that there was truth beneath the discomfort. To others, it signaled quiet confidence, the demeanor of a man unwilling to engage in emotional revisionism or public self-criticism. Either way, the lack of emotional acknowledgement only widened the divide, leaving fans, critics, and industry insiders to fill the silence with their own interpretations. In the end, Björn's refusal to fully engage did not close the conversation. It intensified it, ensuring that his legacy would forever be discussed not only for what he created, but for the cost at which it was achieved. What became increasingly clear was that legacy is not fixed. It evolves with perspective. Björn's achievements remained undeniable, but they were now inseparable from the cost at which they came. Genius and control, brilliance and rigidity, success and sacrifice. These contradictions defined him more than any single narrative ever could. The price of truth. For Benny, speaking out did not bring immediate peace. The reaction was overwhelming, sometimes supportive, sometimes accusatory, but always intense. Old wounds reopened as interviews resurfaced, moments were reanalyzed, and private history became public discourse. Yet, despite the discomfort, there was a sense of release, a feeling that honesty, however painful, was preferable to a lifetime of quiet resentment. He did not attempt to dismantle ABBA's legacy, nor did he deny the magic they created together. Instead, he offered something far rarer: acknowledgement, an admission that greatness often comes at a cost, and that the price is not always shared equally. By refusing to protect a simplified version of the past, Benny reclaimed his own place within it, not just as a contributor, but as a human being whose emotional experience mattered. Truth, it seemed, didn't destroy the music. It changed the way people listened. Time has a way of softening the edges of anger while sharpening the truth beneath it. As the years pass and the noise surrounding revelations begins to settle, what remains is not outrage or defense, but reflection. For Benny, reaching this stage was never about winning a public battle or rewriting history in his favor. It was about finally understanding what it had all meant and deciding what he was willing to carry into the final chapters of his life. At 79, legacy stops being about expansion and starts becoming about honesty. The future grows shorter, the past heavier, and the lies we tolerate lose their usefulness. For Benny, speaking out was not a rupture, but a release, a way of setting down a burden he had carried quietly for decades, reconciliation or acceptance. Many fans still ask whether reconciliation between Benny and Björn is possible, whether time might heal what ambition and control fractured. But the truth is more subtle and far less cinematic. Reconciliation does not always arrive as forgiveness, and closure does not always require reunion. Sometimes, acceptance is the final form of peace. Benny no longer seeks validation from the partnership that once defined him. He has made peace with the knowledge that what they created together was extraordinary, even if the relationship itself was deeply flawed. The music stands on its own now, no longer needing the illusion of unity to justify its greatness. Björn, meanwhile, remains a figure shaped by contradiction, brilliant and guarded, admired and questioned, his legacy intact, but forever altered by perspective. He may never publicly acknowledge the emotional cost of his methods, and perhaps that, too, is part of who he has always been. Some truths are spoken aloud, others are revealed through silence. ABBA was never just four people making music. It was a collision of talent, timing, ambition, and human fragility. The songs endure because they captured emotions that were real, even if the relationships behind them were strained. Love, loss, longing, regret. These weren't abstract themes, they were lived experiences, woven into melody and harmony, whether consciously or not. Understanding the fractures behind the scenes does not diminish the music. If anything, it deepens it. The joy feels brighter knowing how hard it was won. The sadness feels more honest knowing it wasn't imagined. ABBA's legacy does not crumble under truth. It becomes more complete. For Benny, that completeness matters more than perfection ever did. If this story made you see ABBA differently, let us know in the comments. Subscribe for more untold stories behind music's biggest legends. And if you think the truth matters more than the myth, give this video a like. Thanks for watching.